I thought I would do maybe something slightly different, not too different than reading at you for the 30 minutes that I've been allotted. And I'm going to read to you from my latest book called Here in Berlin. In spite of the title, there are a couple of Cubans in here, but mostly not. But I thought it's fun, since these are all little sections, and the conceit of the book is that an unnamed visitor goes to Berlin in the spring, summer of 2013 or 12, and she goes on one mission, which is to collect stories of what's left of the Cuban diaspora, the detritus of Cuba's long association with the Soviet bloc. And then she gets there and realizes, except for a music festival, she can't find Cubans anywhere. And so instead, she begins her wanderings, starts cranking up her creaky German from college, and starts collecting stories. And so these stories are anywhere from 2 or 3 pages to 7 or 8 pages, not much longer. So I'll read a few of those, but in between, I'd love to take a question, maybe two, just to get the conversation going a little sooner. And then, of course, we're going to have the larger Q&A at the end. How does that sound as a MO? Okay, great. So I think I'll start with a short piece called Doppelganger. Oh, hang on a second. I think I got the wrong 79. And I think it's pretty self-explanatory. These are all self-contained stories. The main thing to remember is that these are stories being told to this visitor. The person talking is Dagmar Trapp, and it begins with a quote by Rilke: "Is not your dream to be one day invisible?" So this is Dagmar talking. I don't know about my German accent, we'll see. It never happens anymore, Gott sei Dank, but it lasted a good 20 years. When Eva Braun killed herself, I was just another 12-year-old on the outskirts of Berlin. For a long time, very few people knew who Eva was, who she'd become before dying alongside the Führer, his bunker bride of 40 hours. After the war, photographs of the two of them surfaced, many taken by her. She'd started out as a photographer, And Eva became a national obsession. By the 50s, we knew everything there was to know about her. As it happened, Liebe, I came to resemble her to an astonishing degree. Wild speculations began to circulate that Eva was still alive, that she'd been spotted at the farmer's market in Lichtenberg, my hometown, that she was working as a shop girl at KaDeWe, selling French perfume. That was me. That she changed her name to Trudy Stern and was appearing on stage in Berlin's theatrical fringe. That, too, for a brief time, was me. Eva's shadow followed me everywhere. Though we were nearly identical physically, I cultivated other resemblances, arranging my hair like hers, practicing her Führer-adoring gaze, even adopting 2 Scottish terriers, her preferred pets. I walked mine daily in the Tiergarten, in part, I admit it, to hear the gaping passers-by whispering, "Could it be her?" There's no worse celebrity than being mistaken for somebody else. Worse still when that somebody is a celebrity by association, not by her own achievement. So, to answer your question, yeah, I became notorious, but meaninglessly so and twice removed. It's difficult not to sound melodramatic, but I blame my likeness to Eva for ruining my youth. By the time I was 33, the age my doppelganger cracked that cyanide vial between her pretty teeth, I divorced 3 husbands and suffered multiple suitors, all of whom were racked with distorted longing for her. My 3rd husband, Gerwald, was a biscuit manufacturer who used to blow kisses at me like a schoolboy. But he, like the others, was too terrified to touch me. For our wedding night, he had a special altar built on which he instructed me to lie naked, motionless as a corpse, and strewn with rose petals. Then Gerold lit a halo of candles around my head, muttering Hail Marys and gazing at me for hours. Fortunately, our divorce settlement left me financially comfortable enough to purchase this Charlottenburg flat. I'm right around the corner from all the lovely antique shops on Suarezstrasse. You know, I'm quite susceptible to knickknacks. I can't help myself. Anyway, after the disaster of my last marriage, I put a stop to the Eva charade by dyeing my hair black and penciling on a facial mole. Then I promptly gained 10 kilos by gorging on cured meats and hazelnuts. It was a relief, finally, to be invisible. I returned to my job selling perfume at KaDeWe, where I remained until I retired 16 years ago. You know, I broke every sales record for my French company and was twice awarded vacations in Paris. My dear, let's not enclose ourselves indoors today. The lilacs are in bloom and the acacias nearly so. Soon my life will be over, but you're still a young woman. Do you have a husband? No? Why, 54 is the prime of life. Just wait until you reach my age. We may wish to avert our eyes from decay, but it's our natural state. After all, what is more ravaging than time? In truth, my own life feels no longer than this languorous spring day. Tell me, how is that possible? Most mornings, I stroll the grounds of the Charlottenburg Palace as I once did the Tiergarten. Its faded grandeur reminds me that everyone and everything, however sublime, must pass. So that's one of the 30-something voices in this book. Any questions so far? Yes? Oh, no? Oh, you just moved. It's like an auction. You move, and I'm like, razor 50. Okay. Yes, Ralph?
How did you decide on the voices? What was the origin?
Well, the voices kind of came like very much like The Visitor, a kind of alter ego character for me. I did go to Berlin for 4 months, and for the same mission, a friend of mine told me this story that he had reconstituted his grandmother's Spanish language library among the booksellers of Berlin, and I thought, I have to go. What else is there? What else is left of Cuba and Cubans? And even in my own family, I had an uncle who had studied in Moscow. I have an aunt I've never met who's Russian, a cousin named Vladimir. You know, I mean, all of these interesting cross-cultural arrangements and fusions, and so that's why I went to Berlin. And like The Visitor, I didn't really find much evidence, much to my shock, of that decades-long association. And so I just began to wander, kind of lost. And then I just started picking up stories. I read a lot of history. I went to a Zumba class, made friends, with the teacher who was a former Olympic speed skater. I just started meeting people, hearing stories, and then finding opportunities, almost like these little slits in history where I thought, I want to come up with someone at that peculiar juncture of history. And so that's how these voices came in. Initially, there were over 100 of them, which I edited down to the current 30-something, luckily for all of us. But yeah, it was like a serial possession, I guess you could say. Yeah. Yes?
What fascinates you about the doppelganger?
About the doppelganger? Yeah. Well, I think it's a concept that interests me a lot, and I think about Cuba as a divided, Cubans on the island with the diasporic Cuba, including the exiles and others. Berlin also was a city divided, forcibly divided. And so I think when you're, not just, but I think one of the crazy perks of these divisions is that you always have these mirrors facing each other. What if this side? What if that? You're constantly gauging and gazing at yourself, with your opposite. And for as much as, say, in the Cuban context, people renounce the other. They are more alike than different. And so I'm kind of fascinated by the arguments, the ferocious arguments that are really the flip sides of one another. And so it's a kind of doppelgangerdom for me. Yeah. So I'll read a little more and then we'll take more questions. All right, so I've been talking about the visitor a bit, so maybe I will read a section of her as well, so you can see how she goes about. She has a few sections also where you're following her as she wends around Berlin. And in this section, she has a good friend of hers, the one who told her about the grandmother's, him reconstituting his grandmother's, Cuban grandmother's library in Berlin. Anyway, I refer to him as A, and so he's here for a visit. And it's about a third of the way in the book. Her friend A came to see the visitor in Berlin. He wanted to show her his city, its histories and excavations, its uneasy embrace of the frayed eastern districts. Together they traveled to Karlshorst, where the German armed forces surrendered on May 8, 1945. For a mild-mannered man, A would have been at home in a Kafka story, he knew all about the T-34 tank in the garden. Late afternoons, they devoured enormous slices of Erdbeerkuchen. Strawberries were gloriously in season and spiritedly fought over the bills. The visitor's German was improving by the day, and A complimented her on her accent. His was flawless. Until then, they'd spoken to each other only in English or Spanish or a mix thereof. She'd recounted to him her 3 student summers in Germany. One year, she lived in a commune of Marxist hippies in Freiburg, a capital of Das Kapital set on the toilet tank. Everyone slept with one another, but she demurred. Another summer in Münster, she'd watched a ragtag parade of veterans in their old Wehrmacht uniforms march by her host family's house. Later, the visitor worked for an American firm in Frankfurt, marketing disposable diapers. That's actually true. Don't even get me started on that one. She bought a used Russian Lada that never worked. Her lies began almost immediately. That she'd studied literature in college, that she'd written her theses on Joyce's Ulysses, that she lived above all for poetry. One smitten colleague left chocolates on her desk. She slept with 2 of her coworkers, the Brit in hand soaps and the Swiss intern in detergents. She played table tennis naked at a local spa. After 6 weeks, she quit the job, fleeing her thicket of lies. She resold the Lada to the same dealer for less than what she'd paid for it. The visitor and A spent hours at the 3-story International Bookstore on Friedrichstrasse. There, the visitor learned that Hitler's gifts to Eva Braun had improved over the years. In 1937, he'd given her a book on Egyptian tombs for Christmas. 7 years later, a month before their marriage-suicide pact in the Führerbunker, he surprised her with a silver fox fur cape. Apparently, he'd avoided getting married before so as not to discourage German women from dreaming that one day he might be theirs. The visitor hadn't been lucky in love, but happy and unhappy seemed to her meaningless distinctions now. What mattered was this: did the hardships get her to where she wanted to go? In contrast, A had been gratefully, his word, married to the same German woman for 20 years. Her family hailed from Hoyerswerda and never forgave A for taking their daughter away. The family is a police state, the visitor said, describing how minuscule stages lit up inside her, repeating key scenes from her life. Do people remember only what they can endure, or distort memories until they can endure them? After a long silence, A said, "Childhood is a city you never leave. In Berlin's past, we seek our own." He believed that the tiniest crack in a random window could link one world to another. Then he held up a coffee table book on Bauhaus style. Only things endure. The two discussed translations at length, as well as the untranslatable. They tried to render "me duele una mujer" into another language. After failing miserably, you can all try later if you want. "Me duele una mujer." After failing miserably, they treated each other with even more tenderness than usual, as if to acknowledge the inadequacy of words. The visitor had nicknamed A jicotea, after he'd once described his dancing style as resembling a turtle fighting its way out of a paper bag. A perennial subject for them, their unbearable mothers, whom they joked had been separated at birth in Havana. Why, they wondered, had their mothers' particular sufferings and dislocations left them so indifferent to the misfortunes of others, so inflated about their self-worth, so violent? In the visitor's childhood home, dissent wasn't permitted. The daily temperature was set by her mother's rage. As a girl, her resistance had bloomed stealthily. She grew duplicitous, calculative, split herself to survive. Her public self was agreeable, loyal to a fault. All the while, her private self was growing cutthroat. One eye on the exit, a Molotov cocktail in each hand. She told A that she'd had to become a little monstrous to survive. A asked the visitor if she planned to include her personal history alongside the stories she was collecting and retelling in Berlin. Everything that obsessed her, she insisted, was autobiographical in the extreme. "Have you noticed," the visitor said, changing the subject, "how the SS drumbeat sounds a lot like the clave?" It was another drizzly morning, and they were at the cemetery for Russian soldiers who died in the final assault on Berlin. Carajo. He rarely cursed. We always repeat what hurts us. The visitor surveyed the sea of tombstones, each with its pitifully inadequate synopses. The shadows looked rinsed in the weak light. "Not everyone who dies finds rest," A said. On their last afternoon together, the two ducked into a Brazilian bar off the Nollendorfplatz to wait out a thunderstorm. As the samba music played, A told the visitor tales about the Blue Division of the SS, its ranks filled with veteran Spanish soldiers, how they'd fought in the Reichstag to the bloody end. The two made a pact to write overlapping stories about them. That night, they attended the Philharmonic to hear Bruckner's Symphony No. 7. 68 years earlier, a recording of its adagio was broadcast on Radio Berlin after Admiral Dönitz's address to the nation. "Hitler has fallen," Dönitz announced, fighting to his last breath for Germany. During the scherzo, electricity spontaneously rushed through the visitor's body and out the crown of her skull. Her flesh was singing. It said, "Yes, yes, yes." So that's a little bit of the visitor. Any questions? Interstitial questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, it reminds you of what? I've missed the title. Oh, yeah. No, I haven't read that book, but I was very influenced structurally. I also have included some of my own photographs in this book. Is Sebald's work, this sense of creating through interviews, through photographs, other evidences, this sense of faux authenticity. You know, in fact. that has, when I've read from the book, people have read the book, they assume that because I'm a former journalist, that these were actual collected stories and not fiction. But they are fiction, but I wanted you reading it to experience them as if they were actually being told to this visitor. And because of her anonymity, just the way you sit next to someone on a plane and they tell you things like, "What? Why me? Why are you telling me this?" That kind of anonymity, that sense of her being an outsider, made her privy to all of this intimacy. And she talks, because the book refers back a lot to the World War II, so she interviews a lot of old people in this novel as well. And some of the stories begin to intersect. There's this sort of rhizomal feel of the roots connecting. A number of them visit the same ophthalmologist, for example, this Angolan ophthalmologist in Berlin, and things like that. But none of that was, I didn't plan it that way, that this structure kind of emerged as these voices were emerging and as I was reading and rereading Sebald and a lot of other histories, in fact. Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else right now? Yes.
I think I probably have two questions about Chapter, etc. The first is, so the idea that you started talking about disappearing diasporas seems really interesting, and I wonder if in the novel you try to put that side by side with the nostalgias of the culture war that people have written about around Berlin, in some ways around Cuba, so I wonder if that's a disappearance of nostalgia.
Oh, absolutely. That was another thing that drew me. As I didn't know about it before I got to Berlin, but there's also a lot of East Berliners who now have a kind of exile-ish nostalgia for East Germany before the wall came down. And there's a fair amount of idealization, which goes hand in hand with nostalgia, not that dissimilar from Cuban exile nostalgia for the island, pre-1959 Cuba. So that I found very, very fascinating too. And there are some East Berlin voices in this book as well that not just speak to that, but also speak to the particular and specific kind of historical moments in which they lived. There's for example, there's a Eastern minister of kind of in the Ministry of Culture of East Germany, who talks about this assignment he got to come up with a dance craze to rival those convulsing the West. And so I play around a lot with those sense of that sense of belonging, allegiance, absurdity, all of these things that emerge not just because of these divisions, but in a way kind of curiously nurtured by these divisions. Yeah. Okay. Do I have time for one more little one, or we? Okay. Okay, one more. I thought, that maybe. Let's see. This will be a pretty short one. It's three pages, and I just read how the visitor in A, her friend A, talked about writing stories about the Blue Division. And so this is the Blue Division little voice story, and it's told by a Cuban, Maria Elena Molina, who's doing research in Berlin. And it starts off with a joke, Cuban joke. And maybe I'll have Dariel translate it for us, at least the punchline. So, Dr. Molina, do you know what the eighth wonder of the world is? The visitor. No, what? Dr. Molina. Un cubano que no hable mierda. Dariel? Yeah, Cuban who doesn't talk shit. Okay, so here she is. She's a historian. Even for an academic specializing in modern Europe, it was a complicated story, or at least it grew more complicated than she expected. Dr. Molina was in Berlin doing research on the Blue Division of the German SS, which had been comprised largely of Spanish soldiers. While poring over archival military records, she discovered that her maternal grandfather had fought among them. The citation noted that one Alfredo Molina García of Zaragoza had been decorated by the Blue Division for single-handedly disabling a T-34 tank near the Brandenburg Gate and killing 7 Red Army soldiers of both sexes. Now, this was a radically different story than she'd heard growing up in Hialeah, in the heart of the Cuban exile community. Her family had toasted Abuelo Alfredo's war heroism without fail at birthday parties, christenings, nochebuenas. Every New Year's Eve, when they counted the grapes, threw a bucket of water out the window and shouted, "Next year in La Habana," her grandfather's exploits would be loudly extolled. Dr. Molina assumed this meant that he'd fought with the Allies, but nobody bothered to correct her. She tried to imagine how a man of his convictions might have reacted to such a distortion of his legacy. Dr. Molina provided the visitor with essential historical context. In 1941, she said, General Franco called for volunteers to help the Nazis fight Soviet Bolshevism, and 48,000 Spaniards signed up in 2 days. Actual fact. Like her grandfather, many of the volunteers were former phalangists who continued to wear their telltale blue shirts. Battle-hardened fascists, they fought not only in Spain, but also in Italy and North Africa before signing up with the Nazis to fight the Russians. These mercenaries were credited with taking Stalingrad and holding the city against all odds for the Germans, at least for a time. As the tide of the war turned, Franco recalled his men, but almost none withdrew. A hardcore group, along with some French SS, stayed on long enough to defend the Reichstag. On the day Berlin fell to the Red Army, the Spaniards knew they were dead men and fought to the bitter end, mano a mano, stairwell to stairwell, with grenades, knives, everything they had. Dr. Molina assumed that since her grandfather had made it as far as Berlin with the remnants of the Blue Division, he too must have perished in the Reichstag. In the basement, where the worst of the fighting took place, this historian slid her hands over the old bullet holes in the pillars and walls. She translated the faded Russian graffiti for the visitor. Victory slogans and florid curses, she explained, which had made Gorbachev laugh out loud on a visit some years ago. Dr. Molina said she tried to picture her abuelo Alfredo. Eyes wildly bulging, bearded, stinking, determined, battling his Bolshevik enemies to the last. He was 42 when he disappeared. The upheavals of history, Dr. Molina told the visitor, create the most improbable of human consequences. Her grandfather, she continued, was survived by his wife, Raquel, and their 3 daughters, the youngest of whom was the historian's mother. In 1947, when Alfredo Molina still hadn't returned from the war, his wife agreed to marry Diego Mosqueda, an ambitious tradesman who immigrated with her and the girls to Havana. Dr. Molina's mother became 100% Cuban, and at 17 eloped with a young revolutionary who died fighting with Fidel Castro in the Sierra Maestra. What is it about these women and their politically extreme soldiers? Dr. Molina asked. The mother subsequently fled to Miami, where she worked as a maid at a beach resort. Eventually, she met her husband, also a Molina, who, after waiting tables, fixing cockfights, and trafficking in illegal rhino horns for their purported aphrodisiacal, did I say that right? Properties, became the air conditioning king of Hialeah. According to Dr. Molina, her grandmother kept a worn photograph of her first husband in her nightstand drawer. The historian showed it to the visitor. Alfredo Molina wore civilian clothes, and his right hand rested on a holstered pistol at his hip. His eyes seemed to emerge from his temples, giving him a vaguely amphibian air. On the short side and ostentatiously muscled, he was nevertheless an attractive man. It was said he'd had to shave twice a day to control his stubble. Alfredo Molina had tried factory work, farming, and shoemaking, all unsuccessfully. In the end, Only soldiering had suited him. Dr. Molina pointed to the self-satisfaction in her grandfather's expression, quote, as if he knew his missions were holy, end quote. Her grandmother, the historian said, often tucked the same photograph into her brassiere for comfort or held it pressed to her ear for advice. Do you hear him, Maria Elena? Do you hear him? Abuela Raquel used to murmur, fluttering her husband's black and white face close to her granddaughter's. Sí, abuela, she always lied. Cubans, Dr. Molina said with a shrug, frequently have trouble distinguishing the living from the dead. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Cristina. Now we'll have Dariel read, and I just want to make sure, I think I forgot to give a shout out to the amazing director of the CSREA, Professor Tricia Rose, and this event would not be possible without her. Dariel Suarez.
Thank you, Ralph, for the introduction and for being an all-around amazing human being. Thank you, Cristina, for reading. I'm a huge fan. I've been for a long time, so this is pretty special for this Cuban dude to be doing this event with her. I think I'm just going to read a short story from my collection. I think that makes the most sense. I picked something that isn't too long because I'm very excited about the conversation that we're going to have. I don't think I need to introduce this since I'll be reading the whole thing, but I think all I want to say is that it's actually one of the few pieces in the collection that's inspired by sort of my experiences growing up in Havana. So some of it feels a little bit more personal to me. And I did want to thank Brown University and the CSREA for hosting us. So I'm just going to sort of go right in, and I'm happy to answer questions after. This is called Mudface. It was Mudface's laughter that let us know Rolly had drowned. When we found him, his body floating face down in a deep, filthy puddle, the back of his T-shirt billowing like a trash bag on the surface, he must have been dead for merely minutes. His legs were slightly sunk, his arms spread in calm surrender, as if he were just holding his breath underwater. We followed the sound of Mudface's cackle, which, amidst the nighttime downpour, seemed almost supernatural. We came upon the hole, and right away we knew. Mudface had chased Rolly. He had done it to all of us at one point. In his panic, Rolly had probably lunged against the blinding rain and plummeted headfirst into the dark void beneath him. I remember wondering what he might have felt in that split second, one terror suddenly replaced by another. Rolly's stepfather, a tattoo artist who the neighbors joked wasn't very good, lowered himself sideways along the wall of the ditch. He found his footing in the shallow pool and desperately yanked his stepson, turning him over. The water tossed and gulped in the dark. My father and some of the older men on the block helped him remove Rolly's body. For 5 minutes, he breathed into Rolly's mouth and pressed on his small chest. I was crying, though I did it quietly so my father wouldn't send me to my mother. Tilda, a retired nurse, touched the man's shoulders as if it were made of glass. You did your part, she said. Now let him go. He rose. His big tattoo, identical Chinese dragons whose tongues stuck out toward the center of his chest, appeared to glow in the murky views the night allowed. Maritza, he shouted, pronouncing the last part of her name in a painful moan. Maritza! Mud-faced mother clung to her child, her arms draped over him, her hands clasped just below his heart. Rolly's stepfather located her in the muddling rain. My father began to walk between them, and though I cannot be sure, I believe he shook his head at the tattoo artist. Dad was a boxing trainer, and everyone knew he was good at his job. Perhaps intuiting an oncoming catastrophe, Mudface started to laugh again. Through clenched teeth, Rolly's stepfather told Maritza, "Por lo que tú más quieras, sácalo de aquí." She obeyed, taking her son from the circle the neighbors had formed. I remember her long, sudden hair pasted onto her back as she turned. Jose Antonio, Mudface's actual name, laughed all the way home. He had gotten his nickname the old-fashioned way. Jose Antonio loved, whenever he could, escape his mother's care, to cake his cheeks and forehead in muck, which in Havana was in ample supply. On the night Rolly died, there were only wet streaks left on Mudface's skin. He was our age, but he never attended school with us. We had instructions not to mock him and to recognize his inability to communicate like other children as a condition that, within the larger world we were too young to know, was completely normal. He would utter words here and there that were frequently out of context. His mother seemed to understand him. She often addressed him the way our mothers addressed us, with affection and reproach in equal measure. But she did spend each waking moment by his side. She wouldn't even go to the corner bodega without him, and she refused to ask for favors. Mudface's father split the moment the doctor diagnosed his son. He got on a dingy raft with two friends and crossed the straits to South Florida. I remember my mother saying that it had been the first time my father called someone who had risked his life a coward. Maritza never saw a dollar, did not receive a phone call. A neighbor once said that at least Jose Antonio wouldn't really be affected by an absent father. My mother told her that even if that were true, Maritza would. On certain days, usually toward the end of the week, her eyes filled with tears as she took her son to school. She walked stoically, her chin up, gazing ahead in a manner that prevented others from approaching. Whenever someone paid her a visit, she spoke to them on the porch. Jose Antonio stood behind the window, observing the children on our block, sniffing or chewing on an orange peel. We found it strange until someone explained that we should think of the orange peel as a pacifier and of Jose Antonio as a very small child, despite him being more or less our size. But the truth was that his impaired speech, along with the occasional comments we heard from our parents about the relationship between physical strength and Down syndrome, scared us. Rumor was he had almost killed another child at his elementary school, shoving enough silly putty up the boy's nose to turn his face purple. As a result, Marisa started keeping him at home. It was around this time that she added alcohol to her grocery list. The neighbors suspected that she was falling asleep in the middle of the day because the window and orange peel became an integral part of Jose Antonio's daily routine and, by extension, ours. In Havana, there's no evading anything except the comfortable life, so we invented a game out of Mudface chasing us. Cara de fango, we would taunt him. Mudface. He was smart enough to turn the lock and leave the house. He laughed so hard running behind us that I worried one day his vocal cords would explode and he would go mute. His mother always came out once someone shouted that her son had escaped. Bags sagged under Maritza's eyes, and her coarse lips never quite touched. She told us to scurry into our houses and drag them away with the saddest look I'd ever seen on anyone. The next day, we were back at it. The week after Rolly passed, a couple of clipboard-toting officials examined the site of his death. Whenever a local engaged them, they treated the person as if they had trespassed on a cordoned-off area. They offered no word on when or if the hole would be fixed. The reason for all the excavation in our neighborhoods never bothered our parents. A government representative on television explained that they were doing a massive repair job on the water pipes around the city, which were badly corroded. What no one understood, though in truth they did, because communism makes the absurd look ordinary, is how it would take months to fill the holes they themselves had made. Our streets looked like homes for gigantic moles. As the summer's thunderstorms rolled by, the holes filled with water and turned into black sludge. The children in the neighborhood were instructed to avoid them. There was the fear of falling, fear of diseases, which in Cuba included dengue and cholera, and fear that you might break something and be responsible for it. You did not want to owe the government for a hole in your street. Out of all of us, Rolly was the only one who hadn't climbed down a trench, as we like to call them. His stepfather was protective, especially after Rolly's mother died from a rare form of cancer. Rolly respected him in a way I did not respect my parents, and though I was too young to rationalize it then, I admired Rolly as a result. He was responsible, mature. Tito, Remendao, and I were not. As a result of Rolly's drowning, Marisa took to sitting on a rocking chair on her front porch. She parked a large coffee mug by her feet and one into which she poured her alcohol. Her drinking wasn't a secret, but I've learned with age that there are several levels of privacy and shame, and the mug was perhaps a way to save herself some degree of judgment. Her gaze was no longer stoic, and now seemed lost on some remote point. Our mothers gossiped that she was guarding her son. She didn't want the government to intern him. Whether anyone would actually take him away was unclear. Tito, Remendao, and I spent those days lawyering on a staircase that led nowhere. It was at the end of our neighborhood, abutting a steep hill. I'd always guessed the stairs were meant to allow access to a cul-de-sac above it, but a wall had been built right where the top step landed. What lay behind it, I never knew. The The air was always stronger and cooler on the steps, as if we were close to the ocean. A decapitated statue of José Martí stood on a cement platform next to us. Most of the surface had been defaced with chalk-written declarations of love and name-calling. Tito liked to prop his whole body on his hands and move across the platform, his knees bent for balance, and sometimes he would go to the edge, a 5-meter fall from there, and ask us to dare him to jump. Following Rolly's death, there was none of that. We sat and reminisced about our friend. We decided he was the brightest in the group. There was no debate about this. He wasn't a fighter like Tito, who was one of my father's main proteges, but he wasn't a coward either. And the tattoo artist, for all his supposed mediocrity, took care of him properly, particularly for someone who was not his real father. Rolly never needed clothes, like Remendao, who had gotten his nicknames from the stitch jobs his aunt did to his shoes and shirts. The temple of his eyeglasses were wired to the frames, and once he had gone to school with a rope as a belt. Rolly never had to wear such things. That Mudface had killed him wasn't a tragedy, a word whose meaning we learned from the adults. It was a crime, a word that Tito's mom used and which he began to repeat to us as though he grasped its significance. We adopted the word as our own. Mudface had committed a crime. Therefore, he needed to pay. If pressured to choose, I would confess the idea was probably Tito's, but in my mind, it feels as though it was me who put the plan together. We would wait for a night after a good downpour, so the hole where Rolly had drowned would be filled. Remendao, the craftiest among us, would sneak onto the porch and knock on the living room window. He would offer Mudface an orange. Lured by it, Mudface would come out, and I'd wait for him to chase me. I would run by the hole, and Tito, waiting behind a column de bodega, the closest building to the trench, would push Mudface into the water. We would watch his stocky mass plop like a boulder into the swamp-like mess. Then we were going to laugh. We wanted him to drown in our laughter, to be haunted by it if he were susceptible to such a thing. It took 3 days for the next rain to come. It started in the early morning, a gentle drizzle that crescendoed into a torrential curtain. Soon the street gutters became a stream, churning water and dirt. Rain spurted from the rooftops onto the sidewalks where the children scampered and hollered and flared their tongues at the sky. In the afternoon, the sun picked its way through the clouds just as he was dipping behind the taller buildings, and we knew it was safe to go outside. We assembled by the staircase. Remendao tied a plastic bag with 2 oranges to his belt loop. He had a determined expression which put me at ease. I worried that he might back out and it would have to be me tapping on Mudface's window. When the intro music to the 9 o'clock soap opera began to echo from everyone's television, the whole neighborhood locked itself inside. Tito hid behind the column de bodega. I stood at the near end of Maritza's porch while Remendao held the plastic bag close to his hip. In the poor yellow lighting, I saw him crawl to the window, take a glimpse through the shutters, and rap lightly on them. Seconds later, they folded open. Mudface jammed his forehead against the metal bars, attempting to look down at a crouching Remendao. He hoisted the orange within Mudface's reach, and without hesitation, Mudface snatched it. Remendao stood and flaunted the other orange, tipping his head, telling Mudface to open the front door. I felt a sudden urge to pee. Remendao looked at me and widened his arms. What do I do? He was asking. The remaining orange, now returned to the bag, was pulling his pants to one side. I signaled for him to head for the porch's gate. The door behind him swung inward, and Remendao broke into an awkward sprint, pulling up his pants as if holding on to stilts. He hurried across the street to our row of bushes, while I stepped closer to the porch and whispered, Jose Antonio. Mudface turned and began to run in my direction. His stiff, swinging arms propelled him like the wheel rods of a train. I took off with all my might. The ground beneath me seemed to splash and slip, but it wasn't until I arrived at the hole that I felt myself stumble. Tito shot out from behind the column like a bullet and shouldered Mudface. I ricocheted off Mudface's ribs as if I had smacked against a tree trunk. I drew in a breath worth of air before I hit the water. A broken bone doesn't always prompt immediate pain. Maybe it's the shock or the suddenness of the injury. I recall sensing a clacking and an inability to pivot or heave up myself out of the hole. I kept hopping on one foot, fighting for buoyancy with my arms, though the water did not get past my neck. You fucking retard, Tito yelled. He punched Mudface repeatedly on the shoulders. A right hook caught him hard enough, and he dropped in the water next to me. The waves from the impact shrouded my head. Mudface gasped like a toddler who has just learned to hold his breath underwater. Javier, let's go, Tito said to me, extending his hand. It's broken, I finally said, glancing up. The night clouds looked like gray smoke against the pitch-black sky. The water splashed over my head, and this time got in my nostrils. I choked and coughed. There was thrashing, like an alligator twisting around its prey. Something clasped my torso. My vision blurred, and a strange sense of relief overtook me. I was now certain I was going to faint. Dámelo, Tito said. Give him to me. And then I was on the ground. Remendal's remaining orange, contoured smoothly by the bottom of the plastic bag, oscillated like a pendulum above me. Fuck, he said. Did he fall? Lights flickered on in the distance. Javier! Tito's angry scream had alerted my father. Our parents were trained to know what tones and phrases should draw them from their nooks. Moments later, my father was hovering over me, searching the length of my body with his eyes. His ankle's broken, Tito told him, demonstrating with his fingers the area that was swollen. My father stood. What happened? The water behind him gustled. Jose Antonio was trying and miserably failing to lift himself out of the trench. Did he do this? My father walked carefully toward Mudface. The tip of his shoes were centimeters from Jose Antonio's crown. No, he got him out, Tito said, grabbing by my father's arm. He must have swallowed to temper his voice before repeating as if he were actually starting to believe it. He got him out. Maritza arrived quietly. She saw my father and Tito tugging Jose Antonio from the hole. A trace of resignation, maybe even disappointment, molded her features. My mother and a number of other neighbors congregated around the trench. A few murmured how it was only a matter of time. What they were referring to, I wasn't sure. My father lifted me in his arms, and I groaned, tears sliding down my cheeks. The pain was finally surging up my leg. I stared at Jose Antonio as my father carried me. Someone had brought a towel for him. Maritza was drying his hair as if she had just given him a good wash. Despite the distance and the night, I could see his face clearly, devoid of mud. I waited for his lips to part, for his mouth to release that megaphonic laughter, but it never came. Thank you.